Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Harvey. On this episode, I'm joined by Jim Kzirian. Jim is a partner working out of Philadelphia. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ryan. Thrilled to be here with you today.
So, attraction, motivation, and retention of talent are three objectives that are nearly universal among executive compensation philosophies. Retention of key talent is critical to business success. But how can a compensation committee measure the effectiveness of compensation programs at retaining talent? Today, we're going to discuss the concept of holding power as a tool for gauging retention and addressing the potential retention issues before they become problematic. So, Jim, maybe we can start with just some basic conversation around holding power. Very often with compensation and particularly incentives, there seems to be this tension between designing an incentive that is very retentive versus designing an incentive that aligns to pay and performance. So thinking through that kind of tension, how do we think about holding power as a useful tool for analyzing retention risks?
Yeah, great start, Ryan. Great question. I think holding power is really a key way to understand how locked in your LTI recipients, your executive team is in terms of how tough would it be for an organization to lure them potentially away to exit the company and go to a competitor or to another company. It's really a key indicator of how retentive the program is and how much sort of glue you have, for lack of a better term, for that particular executive. Um, Holding power is generally a concept that takes any outstanding or unvested equity instruments, generally in some cases cash-based LTI awards, and values them to sort of get a handle on what are the dollars associated with keeping someone at the company and how much would an organization have to potentially pay to get them to go to another organization. It's really an important concept to ensure you have enough holding power to make sure your executives are locked in. Oftentimes, investors and boards find it incredibly valuable and important to lock in the senior executive, the leadership team, and make sure that we've got a cohesive way to kind of keep them at the organization and keep them excited about staying at the organization, while also making it challenging for them to be picked off. Another key point here is, I think, ensuring that you have adequate holding power also helps to make sure that the programs are aligned with shareholders. So obviously, the more equity that's at stake, the more LTI instruments that are at stake, the better alignment you have with shareholders, and then presumably with performance, if there's a key component in most cases that's tied to some multi-year performance objective. And the last point I'll make here is that this is really an area that most of our compensation committees are looking at pretty regularly. We'll talk about frequency a little bit later on, but it's a critical responsibility, a critical part of the compensation committees' responsibility to make sure that the executive team is appropriately locked in, that we've got strong retention hooks and good alignment with shareholders in terms of the program overall.
Yeah, I agree, Jim. I mean, I've seen many committees really use holding power as an effective governance tool. And it's, as I said in my opening comments, retention is such a major part of so many companies' compensation philosophies. So having something like this is just kind of part of your normal cadence of governance and review, I think is very helpful. One just quick follow-up question. So, as you walked through how you look at holding power, it sounds like you're really focused on long-term incentives. I didn't hear anything about, base salary or cash bonuses. Is this really about more of the long-term incentive as the key holding power?
Yeah, and Ryan, I might even take that one step further. In a dominant majority of cases, long-term incentives are comprised either entirely or primarily of equity-based instruments. Though I think it's first primarily about equity, so locking in the executives in a way that's aligned with shareholders. And in some cases, as I mentioned earlier, the long-term incentive instruments can also be cash denominated, multi-year kind of cash performance bonus. I think the holding power discussion is entirely about those two buckets. Rarely, if ever, do we have discussions about base salary. Annual incentives to some degree, if you're halfway through the year and a recipient of an annual incentive award, is going to be picked off by a competitor, that those dollars are also at stake. But the holding power analysis in general is primarily about the LTI instrument.
Okay. So let's get into the details. Maybe first of all, I'd love to kind of get an idea of what do you think is the appropriate cadence to look at holding power. So how often should committees be looking at this, and then let's get into the definition of exactly how you would calculate it.
So for most of our clients, Ryan, I would say that review of holding power um, is an annual exercise. We do have some clients that look at it more frequently, but I think another key point here is that it's often done in the context of what we call tally sheets. So that term might be familiar to folks watching the podcast today. It's essentially a summary of the overall pay program, all the elements, not just compensation. It could be severance benefits, change of control benefits, perquisites, other elements of more broadly speaking, actually, it's more appropriate to describe it as the remuneration program overall of the company. And in the context of those tally sheets, we often see companies, including for presentation to the compensation committee, an overview of all the outstanding LTI awards that are at stake. The grant date, if it's an equity-based instrument, the grant price, the vesting period, the performance requirements. And so you can see sort of laid out in a table all the outstanding awards that are there. And when you combine them all together, you can get a very comprehensive look at the total holding power value that you have. And in terms of how you calculate it, it's actually quite a simple calculation. It's just sort of taking all the shares that are held that are outstanding or unvested. We multiply them by a share price. In some cases, it could be a spot price. In other cases, we use a bit of a different methodology, which we'll actually come to a little bit later on. And then you multiply that out, add up all the different awards, and you get a total value. For performance-based instruments, we often see companies including some kind of estimation, perhaps where are the PSUs in the case of equity, or where is the performance-based cash in the case of a multi-year cash award trending in terms of performance and the resulting payout. And so we can adjust performance-based components to reflect that expectation of where we are at any given point on how it's going to pay. And then you add it all up and you get a value, as I mentioned. And then oftentimes that's divided by the annual LTI target value of the recipient. And what that allows you to do is sort of normalize across executives. And of course, if someone has a higher LTI target, you'd expect them to have higher dollars, but on a multiple basis, generally we say 2.5 to sort of 3 times the annual LTI target is a decent rule of thumb in terms of what's a reasonable amount of holding power. So for example, if an executive has $200,000 in annual target LTI grant value, we'd expect to have somewhere between 5 and 600,000 at any given point as a reasonable LTI holding power. Now you could dip below that, right? As you have share price volatility, you can go above that if PSU payout expectations might be more favorable. And there's no scientific or formulaic approach of, where do I have a problem per se? But, as you dip below 1.5 or 2, if your share price is challenged or your grants for whatever reason have decreased or your PSU payouts are unfavorable expectations, you start to kind of scratch your head a bit and say, do I have enough holding power? Do I need to consider taking action? And we'll talk a little bit later about what those actions can be.
Yep. Yep. So a bit like a dashboard, and you start getting below a certain level, it starts maybe flashing orange or even red of something you should keep an eye on. One other thing I've also seen kind of a corollary to holding power that sometimes will be brought up by companies is, well, what about the wealth potential of equity? Because we talk about, well, this is the value if they leave, and obviously that's the kind of hard number that they're going to leave on the table. But particularly if a company is performing well or if there's significant upside, the opportunity to potentially make a lot of money can also in some ways have its own holding power, but it's a little bit difficult to calculate. But I have seen a few cases where for clients, we've shown kind of current holding power, and then we do some projections to show here's maybe the wealth potential of the awards.
Yeah, I agree. And I think in especially in cases, Ryan, where perhaps recipients have gotten awards at a depressed share price, and maybe a company has decided to keep the recipients whole in terms of the value. So we're now going to just divide by a lower share price and give much more in terms of the share count. I think those are the kinds of scenarios where that future modeling, wealth accumulation potential is really important, because if things turn around, then all of a sudden you can have these huge dollars being delivered because of the increase in share count.
Yep. Yep. Any other considerations, from a share price volatility? If company is just really seeing a lot of volatility in share price, anything else you'd want to think about from a holding power perspective?
Well, we talked about the fact that obviously share price is a major variable
Mm.
when you're calculating the value of the holding power, and applying that share price to, let's say, each of the outstanding equity awards that are on the table. Um, Sometimes we see organizations using a long-term average. I have some clients that, especially if they're kind of having severe extreme volatility in their share price, maybe they use a 6-month average. I have one that uses a 1-year average. Some companies use a 30-day average. The approaches can vary substantially, but the concept of kind of smoothing, if you're dealing with a share price situation where there's volatility, is pretty common out there. And I think that could be a helpful way to kind of reduce the bumpiness and how things might look if you're just using a spot price. We talked a little bit a moment ago about, if you've got a substantially depressed share price, which can reduce holding power, having some understanding and visibility on what things would look like if my share price got back to where it was or it improved substantially. I think that's really important. And, when you have a share price that's substantially depressed, there are different approaches that organizations might take. They might keep you whole on the share count in terms of how they're determining the number of shares, but sometimes you'll have organizations that will use a bit of a premium to the share price. They might shift to cash if they're challenged in terms of the amount of shares they have available. So these are all factors at play that you'd have to take into account when you're thinking about analyzing your holding power and how it's turning out.
So let's shift gears maybe a little bit and just think a little bit about influences on holding power. Maybe a good place to start is just LTI design and mix. What are some of the kind of the common LTI mix or design elements that can have a significant impact on holding power?
We have seen in recent years, more commonly, organizations using what we call a portfolio approach to LTI. So nearly all organizations use at least two instruments. Maybe it's time-based shares and performance-based shares. In some cases, they might have three instruments incorporating stock options. But as we think about the impact of different kinds of instruments on holding power, what I would say is generally more time-based instruments, particularly restricted stock or restricted stock units, any full value shares that vest with the passage of time, can help to strengthen, or maybe stabilize holding power on one hand, but they also reduce potential upside, right? If share price is growing quite nicely, or if we have really favorable performance and we don't have the benefit of a substantial PSU component, we might not have as much upside. So time-based instruments will help to stabilize, but PSUs can really provide what we call double leverage, which can be the combination of variability in the number of shares that you get based on performance, but then also variability in the value that you might receive based on the share price at the time of vesting or when the performance period concludes. So different instruments have a different impact, but I think all of them play an important role in comprehensively contributing to a meaningful holding power in a way that also aligns with shareholders and drives performance that the board may be looking for. And then the last point, Ryan, maybe that I'll make here is related to stock options. If you have a situation where you're making option grants each year and an organization sees healthy long-term share price growth, and presumably the options have some 3-year or 4-year, let's say, ratable vesting schedule, options can also be a very powerful instrument for contributing to holding power over time. Now, of course, because it's a derivative, if the share price is flat or challenged, that could go completely the other way, right? Options can be problematic because if you have no value with a declining or flat share price, they could play the opposite, have the opposite impact. holding power. So each instrument has a role. And what I really like about it is when you combine them and look at it comprehensively, they can really piece together quite nicely.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Stock options in particular, as you said, can add a fair amount of volatility to the holding power. If, like you said, stock price is up, you can see it really increase holding power, and if stock price is down, you can really see it have a negative impact. So that adds some volatility there. But so let's say a committee is reviewing this regularly, and the dashboard is flashing yellow. They're kind of below ideal holding power levels, and they also have other kind of concerns from a retention perspective that they might have some issues there. What are some things that they should be thinking about that might be able to boost that holding power?
We've seen committees take a variety of approaches. One approach that executives often want to pursue and committees sometimes are a little bit skeptical is making some kind of special grant, an off-cycle award. Oftentimes, if it's in the context of a depressed share price and really focused squarely on retention, it could be all or mostly time-based shares. In some cases, committees want to drive performance, a reward for, let's say, hitting a home run, or in some cases, a grand slam, while also reinforcing retention. You might see a combination of performance and time, or in rare occasions, you see all performance, which is easier to sell to proxy advisors and investors, certainly, and can be a powerful mechanism for driving performance and enhancing line of sight. But overall, special awards can be challenging, right? On one hand, they're a powerful instrument. They can drive motivation, retention, performance orientation, but there are optics concerns associated with them. Proxy advisors generally can be quite skeptical. They can use them as a reason for bringing up sale and pay concerns. Institutional investors oftentimes, on one hand, can be understanding if you engage with them and have the discussion, but on the other hand, generally they're starting from a place of skepticism because the hypothesis oftentimes can be, what's wrong with our regular incentive plan? Why do we need this out of the ordinary um, dimension of the pay program? But they can be quite a powerful tool. And Ryan, you and I have worked through these with clients, and we often see our colleagues dealing with the possibility of a special long-term incentive grant for many of our clients. Another mechanism that we often find and that we discuss with clients is what I'll call an enhanced regular grant. So if an executive is receiving $400,000 a year in their LTI target, maybe the committee in a year where there are concerns about retention or holding power, we might award them 500 or 600,000 in the same form with the same mix and the same design parameters as the ongoing grant. And that's a way to provide a little bit of juice, some extra retention hooks, extra holding power in a year where we might not be thrilled with where holding power is currently, but also likely faces less scrutiny and skepticism, particularly externally. So those are two key ways. There are a variety of other mechanisms that companies often consider, but those are, I would say, two that come to top of the list in terms of how companies deal with this.
Yeah, no, good kind of overview of some of the considerations there, and of course, we could spend a whole kind of lengthy discussion just on building retention into compensation, but a couple of good ones to think about. So maybe as we close out here, Jim, just kind of recap for us how would you suggest committees incorporate holding power, into their annual cycle, and what are some of the ways things that they should be thinking about as they do that through the course of the year?
Yeah. So Ryan, in closing, I think we mentioned holding power review is a critical responsibility of the committee to make sure that your executive team is locked in and that the company is doing everything it can to make it challenging for them to be recruited by another organization. We often weave it into, I mentioned tally sheets, part of the annual cycle. Most companies have this woven in if they have a formal calendar where they talk about their meetings and the topics at each of the meetings. The review of tally sheets and holding power is a key element that's woven into that annual cycle. I didn't mention this earlier, but I do have some clients that actually show tally sheets, let's say in the appendix or in the backup at every comp committee meeting. It's not necessarily super common to do that, but we do have some clients that do that. And so board members and committee members can look at holding power at any meeting if they want to, go into the appendix in detail. It's a really important a critical responsibility of the committee to look at this and to make sure that your long-term incentive program, whether it's all equity-based in most cases or sometimes incorporating cash, is doing what it's designed to do. And one of the most important objectives of long-term incentives is to make sure that our team is retained, they're aligned with shareholders, and they're excited about outperforming and doing meeting the expectations of investors and the board. And so that's how I would close this out. I think it's a really key responsibility of the committee.
Yep, agreed. Now, this is definitely something I'd recommend committees keep an eye on at least annually. And and I think it's worth saying the obvious that holding power, is an important thing to look at. It's typically not the issue that's going to drive retention. It's not, someone isn't leaving the company because they're only disappointed about their holding power. They're usually looking at other opportunities for a variety of reasons, business opportunities and whatnot within the organization. But having that adequate holding power, like you said at the beginning, really provides that stickiness, and hopefully makes it that much more difficult for a competitor to lure them away. So. Well, Jim, thanks again for joining the podcast. I think it's been a very interesting and helpful discussion.
Great, Ryan. Thanks so much for your time.